Okay, this is the Huber colliery, Huber breaker, or also known as blue coal. This is the last standing coal breaker of over the 400 that were in existence in just the northern anthracite field. What is special about this breaker are a few things. One, it being the last standing breaker in the northern anthracite. Two, this is the only breaker that dyed its coal blue, as in the sign on the building here. It says Home of Coal, America's Finest Anthracite. And three, it was the most modern breaker of its time to ever be built. Now, we're going to be doing a series of videos on this breaker, so I figured I'd point out a few of the buildings that are here. The first main building over here is our powerhouse, with the big smokestacks and coal silos. Between the powerhouse and the breaker, you can't see it, but there's a pond called the door thickener. The main breaker itself, right there in the center, this building that says blue coal on it is called the retail coal pockets. That was built later. This was built in the mid-50s. The breaker itself opened February 1st of 1939. And then the two buildings over there were known as the foreign coal dump. Now this was your main central part of the colliery, and then you have your shops. So we'll take you around the breaker and show you a few of these things. Okay, so here we're at step one of basically the whole process. The coal has already been taken out of the mine and put into rail cars. From this point here, this would be line number one. The rail yard extended 90 train lines out that way. Here's what we call the foreign coal dump. It's exactly what it means. The foreign coal dump is coal that came from other collieries and different sites, for example, strippings, say other local collieries. The train cars would be designated and put here to be taken up to the breaker. Other coal besides this would be taken only from this colliery. So we'll take a look inside the building. So now we're inside the building. You can see that there was multiple lines here. There was about 4 rail lines that would come in here. And what would happen was these large train gondolas would come in that were bottom dump, and they would drive over these bays here. You can see they're filled in, and the coal would dump here. And underneath these bays, you can't see it now, but there was a conveyor that took it over to that building there. Now, the coal at this point, before it already came here, was probably washed, or it might have been icy during the winter, which in store they put a large vibrator here. This vibrator would drop down over the top of the train cars and vibrate to break up any stuck material or frozen material here, and then it would drop down and go out the conveyor. There's only one active train line left, which is over there, and that's the Central New Jersey rail line. Out of all 90 train lines that were here in this yard, that's the only active one left.
And this was the only area of the 90 rail lines that was actually covered?
Yeah, this was the only small building here that was designated as the foreign coal dump. And all the cars would have to be designated to this one spot. So now we'll take a look into the next building where it would lead to the breaker. Okay, so now this is the second step of the foreign coal dump process, which is the foreign coal dump is right behind us. This next process is, it comes up, we'll show you here, it comes up this main conveyor. It comes up the main conveyor, which is right there. It's filled in now. And it comes up behind me here to this 90-degree bend. And at this 90-degree bend, it goes up to what they call the main conveyor here. And in this main conveyor, this is where all the coal from the mine, from the foreign coal dump, from any colliery, any coal entering this plant would come up this main conveyor right here. We'll show you when we get to the top of the main conveyor what it looks like, but this was driven by a 500 horsepower electric motor. this whole plant was all electric power. Now here's another view of the main conveyor in the complex, just to give you a clear idea of how the coal goes to the top of the breaker and the whole setup of the colliery here. Okay, so we just climbed the entire length of the main conveyor here. It goes all the way down back to the foreign coal dump. Now up here, I pointed out to Justin a minute ago, these bars that you see hanging down here, they're periodically spread throughout the breaker. This is so if you have some really big lumps, or if the conveyor gets overloaded with coal, everything won't go tumbling back down the conveyor. This is kind of like a check to make sure nothing comes rolling back down. Now you can see here that this conveyor is a continuous loop. Here's the top of it where it would be circulated back down, and then it would loop around and come back up the bottom. Now we'll show you the very head of the breaker where the whole, I call it the heart of the breaker, where the whole thing would operate off of. Here we are at the very top of the breaker, 136 feet above ground. This is what drove the entire main conveyor. Over here we have what's left of a 500 horsepower General Electric motor that would drive this whole gear ratio to drive this conveyor. This conveyor would go around, and at the top here, there's some chutes where the coal would empty out into chutes to go down to the second stage, which is the picking tables, where they would pick the rock out of the coal and bust up lumps that were too big. Now here we are at the top of the breaker. We'll give you a good definition of how the rail yard was set up. Down over there is where our foreign coal dump is, that little building over there. The rail yard extended from that foreign coal dump all the way out to where those first row of houses were, 90 rail lines, and that's the only active line that's left. Over there where you see that fresh grass, that is now was a reclamation job. There was a massive coal bank there. And one thing about Huber also was Huber was kind of the experimental colliery, a very modern colliery. At one point, they actually had an aerial tramway that ran from the breaker out to the colliery. An aerial tramway, as exactly what it means, there was cables with buckets that would take refuse from the breaker all the way out to the refuse bank. Okay, now here we are at the under rear of the main conveyor, which is now above us. The conveyor would empty out into this chute, which is split somewhat equally to two classifying tables, as they call them, to pick out rock. Before they get to the classifying tables, they go on what are called shaker tables here. These tables have different sized screens on them, and they would shake somewhat like this, except very vigorously. This is so the smaller coal could pass on to the rest of the breaker and be crushed and processed. The larger lumps of coal and or rock would pass on to those vibrating tables, men would pick out the large lumps and break them up, or pick out lumps of rock.
And for those who don't know, basically the screens are the pieces of metal you see here with the holes cut in them, and each set of tables had a different size
screens. And they would go down to as small as 1/16 of an inch.